I'll start with a few housekeeping items as we're getting started. It's a great group that we have here today. I'm so happy to be here with colleagues and this audience. And what is a monumental, what is really a monumental occasion, pulling this together with participants from Russia and Chile and Argentina and here in the US. I really appreciate all the work that everyone is doing, and I want to, at this time, share the agenda with everyone, including the panelists and the attendees, for what we'll be doing today. This is our Symposium on Indigenous Leadership in the Emerging Green Economy, Mining Silicon Valley, and Global Environmental Justice. So my name is Sybil Diver. I work at Stanford University, where I co-lead the Environmental Justice Working Group, and I also teach in the Earth Systems program, and it's an honor to be here today as a facilitator. So I'll just share a few housekeeping items as people are getting on the meeting. So first, I've shared the agenda for today in the chat. So people can look at that in English or Spanish as it's comfortable for you. And the second thing I want to mention is that there's an incredible number of organizations who have supported this event and made it possible. And so I want to just acknowledge and thank all of the co-sponsors in the group. And there's so many that I'm not going to read them out, but I will list everyone in the chat to just give you a sense of the range of support and the range of organizations that have been working together on this. It's quite an exciting conversation that we're starting today. And the next thing I want to be sure to highlight for today is that we're hosting a multilingual meeting, and Ella has kindly placed instructions for this in the chat. I want to make sure everyone knows that you'll want to choose one of the language options, Russian, English, or Spanish, so that you can get access to all the presentation information. And you can do that by going to the Zoom controls at the bottom of your screen to switch channels between languages. This is in the taskbar where you can click on globe, and you can see the globe icon there at the bottom. And then please click on the language that you would like to hear. And so we have some instructions here. Thanks to Neha for sharing those. I want to also note that to access the language interpretation, you do need to be using the Zoom application on your computer, phone, or device. And we're going to just say thank you for your patience as we work through the technology that we need to communicate across cultures and languages and countries. So thank you for that, for your patience. We might need some reminders for people to speak slowly and clearly today, but we're so grateful to our interpreters and everything that they're doing to make this possible. And then the third housekeeping item before we get started is on audience participation. We are using the Q&A function to communicate with attendees for the event today. We will not be using the chat. Please feel free to use Q&A at any time to send a message to the panelists. We're glad for your questions and comments. So with that, I'll thank everyone once again for being here today. And I'm going to invite Alexi Sagona to start us off. Alexi is a member of the Amamutsun tribe, and he's been working with the Amamutsun youth group, and also is a PhD student at the University of California, Berkeley. So welcome, Alexi, and thank you for starting us off with a land acknowledgement. And you can unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sybil. Thank you everyone for making this event possible. Akui Mishimpi, Mishmin Arua, Kanraka Alexi. Welcome, good morning. My name is Alexi and I'm a member of the Amamutsun, part of the greater Ohlone peoples. And today I'm talking to you from the lands of the Chochenyo Ohlone speaking people here in Berkeley, California. But I'll be offering a land acknowledgement for Stanford University, the Symposium host site. So Stanford sits on the homeland of the Ramaytush and Tamyan speaking Ohlone peoples, represented today by the Muwekma tribe and other descendant communities who continue to act as stewards of these lands. We acknowledge their work and respect their inherent sovereignty and self-determination by supporting efforts to return ancestral lands to the original indigenous stewards here in the San Francisco Bay Area and beyond. We also honor the other indigenous lands where these conversations are taking place. Thank you, and I will now pass it over to Gabriel Saiz to speak.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, wait.
Go ahead, Gabi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexi, for those words. I am speaking today from Acamel A'atham and Pipash land in Phoenix, Arizona. Aho ongade, ingachi akaudan, panka ijaje wiwitate, dadanche, pankavali. Hello, everyone. It is very good to see you. My English name is Gabriel Saiz, and my Ponca name is dadanche. I am Oshni Ponca, or Northern Ponca. I, along with other Native people from all across the United States, had the privilege of being a part of Stanford University and a guest on Ohlone land. For many other Native students and I, time here allowed us to discover our passions and pursue justice for Indigenous communities. In our pursuit of knowledge and in overcoming tribulations, we maintained our dignity in the face of settler colonialism. We achieved because we were young, Indigenous, capable people, and our ancestors always watched over us. So on behalf of the Native students at Stanford, past, present, and future, who give their time and their lives to their community's well-being and the well-being of other Indigenous communities throughout the world, I want to congratulate you on the courage to speak about hard issues like mineral extraction, environmental justice, and I hope that everyone attending learns something and that we all endeavor to use what we learn here to make the world a better place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabi. We really appreciate that. And I want to say congratulations to you upon your graduation also from Stanford this spring with your master's. So many accomplishments, and thank you for the beautiful welcome. I'll pass now to Galina Angarava for some opening remarks. Galina is a representative of the Iqarit Nation of the Boreal peoples and Executive Director of Cultural Survival, and she'll introduce herself more fully and share some opening remarks. Thank you, Galina.
Thank you, Sybil. Sembena hundutun hudut. Greetings, dear friends, sisters, and brothers. Thank you, Alexi and Gabrielle, for starting this event in a good way and acknowledging the lands of your ancestors. I welcome you all to this symposium, and I would like to also express my gratitude to the friends and colleagues at the Stanford Environmental Justice Working Group, Sybil, Laura, Lena, and other co-organizers, Pavel from Batani Fund, David Gordon, Kate Finn from the First Peoples Worldwide. I also want to express my solidarity with all Indigenous sisters and brothers who are on the front lines, fighting to protect their ways of life, their lands, territories, their self-determination, but are not here with us today. My name is Galina Angarava. I'm an Indigenous woman and I'm an Indigenous rights activist belonging to the Abzai clan of the Iqarit Nation of the Boreal peoples in Siberia. I'm also a guest on the lands of the Ohlone people, which is now known the San Francisco Bay Area. And I'm the Executive Director of Cultural Survival. We are a veteran Indigenous people's rights organization, Indigenous-led organization, with almost 50 years of experience working to protect Indigenous people's rights and support Indigenous people's self-determination, cultures, and political resilience since 1972. We're a staff of 28 people, mostly women and mostly Indigenous, working in 9 countries around the world. We work through a holistic strategy and wraparound programming supporting Indigenous communities through advocacy, capacity building, and grant making. And thematically, we work through a rights-based approach centering Indigenous well-being on the nexus of climate change solutions, land defense, food sovereignty, freedom of expression, and the leadership, and centering Indigenous women and youth as the protagonists to achieve our collective self-determined future. I want to talk about who Indigenous peoples are and why we are important in this conversation more than ever. The general approach to answering this question includes anthropological, cultural, historic, and some political context. The term and category Indigenous peoples, often capitalized to convey a distinct identity, has prevailed and was used as an umbrella term to refer to distinct groups of people such as tribal peoples, original peoples, First Peoples or nations, Native, Aboriginal, nomadic, and semi-nomadic, and many communities also prefer to be known by their own names. According to the International Labour Organization, there are 476 million Indigenous peoples living in 90 countries, belonging to almost 5,000 different cultures, representing around 6.2% of the total global population. We are the speakers of most of the 7,000 languages presently spoken in the world today. Some of the common characteristics of Indigenous peoples include having a historical continuity, pre-invasion, pre-colonial societies, distinct culture, having our own language, relationship to the land and territory, our own land use practices, being minorities and distinct from a dominant society, and most importantly, self-identification as Indigenous peoples. So why are we here? As Indigenous peoples around the world, we find ourselves in the junction of the history of human civilization that we're standing in the way of the total destruction of this planet. Indigenous peoples' lands are the remaining strongholds of biological diversity. While being only 6.2% of the global population, Indigenous peoples managed lands and territories span 24% of the total land surface. And these lands are home to the majority of the remaining biodiversity. Indigenous peoples manage at least 24% of the total carbon stored above ground in the world's tropical forests. And this is just a sample of numeric scientific findings and data that exist and available today. We Indigenous peoples are the best stewards and experts of our own environments. We're the best guardians of our lands. Our lives are deeply interconnected with our landscapes. We even carry the knowledge of our lands and our biodiversity in our languages. Our languages reflect the silhouettes of the landscapes, and nature is mimicked in our sounds, our dances, and our songs. Our worldview, our traditional knowledge, our cultures and cosmovisions are all reflected in our languages. But so many times, large corporations, governments, and even large environmental organizations take over the lands of Indigenous peoples, infringe upon the rights of Indigenous peoples without any consultation and consent, bringing total destruction and devastation to our communities. And one of my elders once told me, be careful about some new exciting ideas and things that come in shiny packages, because they are just reinventions of the old. I didn't quite understand that at the time, But what I understand today is that what he meant by that was the old paradigm of taking, thinking, extraction, and greed. It's time to change that. It's time to center Indigenous leadership. Not only seeking our advice or information or even inviting us to the table, but centering, upholding, and respecting our leadership as rights holders, traditional knowledge keepers, and guardians of our own lands, territories, and resources. Today, we're here to talk about the impacts of the transition to the green economy on Indigenous peoples. As the green economy continues to grow, the demand for electric vehicles and materials such as lithium, cobalt, copper, and nickel will continue to grow as well. And this means companies rushing to secure their supplies for these minerals and increased pressure on Indigenous peoples' lands, increased conflicts, increased number of Indigenous peoples affected by mining. And that means man camps, prostitution, disease, displacement, loss of culture, and murder. Sounds very similar. Sounds very much like the same old thing wrapped in a shiny package of the so-called green economy. And my question is, green economy for who? For the select ones living in the so-called wealthy countries? And at what cost will this transition be achieved? As the green economy continues to grow, so will the pressure on Indigenous peoples. There's tremendous overlap between mining sites for this mineral and Indigenous peoples' lands. As we speak, these minerals are being mined in Russia, Papua New Guinea, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, Democratic Republic of Congo, and communities around the world around these mines, as well as experts, have raised concerns about the environmental and social impacts on these communities. Today is important more than ever that we build solidarity and a community of Indigenous leaders and our allies to make sure that this transition to the green economy centers justice and equity, abides to the principles of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and respects Indigenous people's self-determination and free, prior, and informed consent. And now I'm going to segue to the next segment of the symposium, the case for responsible mineral sourcing, Indigenous rights, and global mining. And it is my pleasure to introduce to Pavel Sulyandziga, who is one of the renowned Indigenous leaders who dedicated his entire life to the protection of Indigenous peoples in Russia and globally. He was the member of the United Nations Working Group on Business and Human Rights, tasked with the promotion of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Until 2010, he was the first vice president of the Russian Association of the Indigenous Peoples of the North and the member of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. He is now the president of the International Indigenous Fund for Development and Solidarity, Batani, based in Maine, USA. Passing over to you, Pavel.
Спасибо большое, Галина.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Galina. Thank you, Sybil. I would like to express my gratitude to my colleagues and friends for organizing today's dialogue. I wanted to tell you that when we discussed today's meeting, we were thinking about the title, the name for the meeting. We considered multiple versions, and we chose today's title that highlights the leadership of Indigenous communities during the transition to a green economy. We know all too well that the problems that suffered by indigenous communities from the extractive industries, from gold diggers and oil producers, we are left with dirty lands. During today's discussions about the green economy, we have to focus on the initial stages of this green economy. And we have to consider and understand all the problems that exploitation of indigenous lands had brought us before. It's important for the benefits of the green economy to not be, as Galina mentioned, transferred to a select group of people in capitalist countries, but to spread the wealth from this progress. And we can't be separated in this process so that one group lives on one planet and another on the other. I wanted to share two practices with you. First represents the example of my people, the Udege people, in our struggle for our lands. Our lands were sold for 30 years to a South Korean company, Hyundai. We had started our struggle to keep the forest logging away from our territories so that we continue our traditional way of life. After that, gold diggers arrived in our territories. Coal miners followed suit. As Galina mentioned, the native lands are rich with natural resources and represented valuable lands to big corporations. And there were many who came to our lands wanting to take advantage of them. In my mind, we persevered and won in our struggle. We are a very small group. There are 4 villages, a drop in the bucket of the world's population. But we were able to do that, to achieve our results, because my people, the Udege people, at a critical time, we united together. Secondly, we were aided by numerous allies, local residents of the Primorsky region in Russia, who wanted to preserve our native lands, the Udege Taiga. Of course, we weren't the only ones using those lands, but people from across Russia used our lands and visited the Taiga and wanted to conserve it. We were aided by environmental activists and scientists, and this joint movement allowed us to preserve our territory. And it's very important to consider this example in the global indigenous rights movements by groups who are likewise being pressured by corporations and governments because of their land resources. The second example is more recent. It's still hard to assess what results this campaign will bring. It involves the Russian company Nornickel, one of the largest corporations involved in nickel mining that works on indigenous lands. Last year, the company was responsible for an environmental catastrophe, greatly affecting indigenous peoples of the Russian Arctic in Taimyr. The indigenous peoples of Taimyr approached Batani Foundation with a request to help their work with Nornickel and help with trying to reach Nornickel's representatives. Our capacity as indigenous people's capacities remain low, but our solidarity and trust that infuse our current campaign result in our strategy for the campaign. We had noticed a call by Elon Musk, the head of Tesla. He pleaded with the nickel producers and promised long-term contracts for nickel miners across the world. Having noticed this appeal by Musk, we sent him a proposal and a call not to purchase nickel from Nornickel and to avoid Nornickel altogether until the Russian company begins to respect the rights of indigenous peoples and stop inflicting harm on the environment in the Russian Arctic. Thanks to a group of allies, including environmental companies, we began negotiations and a dialogue with Tesla. And later on, with the help of the same allies, we started negotiations with Swiss and German banks and the German company BASF. A group of indigenous leaders from Russia visited Switzerland, where Nornickel's investors and Nornickel's subsidiaries are based. We are currently beginning negotiations with Nornickel's representatives itself. We want to discuss the problems faced by indigenous peoples of Taimyr and Murmansk Oblast, where Nornickel is also present. We want to discuss these problems and ask our questions about the relationship between Nornickel and indigenous peoples. I hope these negotiations will be fruitful and will bring concrete results to the indigenous peoples who suffered damages because of Nornickel's operations. And as Galina has mentioned, the solidarity of indigenous people who are suffering because of the actions by corporations. I hope we can talk to these indigenous communities and share our expertise and our practices and our experience in this realm, as mentioned by Galina and as will be discussed by the colleagues during today's seminar. Once again, I'm very grateful for the meeting, and I hope we'll come to results in our joint struggle for indigenous lands and rights.
Спасибо большое, Pavel. Thank you very much, Pavel. We appreciate all of your work and the message of solidarity that you're bringing to us today. And so now, what a wonderful opportunity to hear from leaders working with Russian indigenous peoples. We'll now shift to hearing from colleagues from South America. And I'll invite Emma Harrison from the Center for Interdisciplinary Environmental Justice to introduce our next speaker, Jorge Alvarez. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you so much, Sybil. And it's really a great honor to get to introduce Don Jorge Alvarez, who is Indigenous Licantay from the Salar de Atacama in the Antofagasta region of Chile. Jorge is from the Coyo community, which is responsible for the care and administration of important sites within the Salar de Atacama, including Lake de Benquiche, the Balinache Lakes, and the ruins of Tulor. Jorge and the community of Coyo asked the Chilean government to designate these important places with a protected status, which has allowed them to manage the impacts of tourism and urban growth in the region. And today, Jorge is fighting to expand that protection to the rest of the Salar de Atacama, which is being threatened by the rapid expansion of lithium mines. Thank you so much for being here today, Jorge.
Bueno,
Well,
buenas tardes.
good afternoon.
Soy indígena de Calantay, Atacama.
I'm Indigenous. I would like to greet all of the people who are listening here in the Americas. The struggle is very strong against the mines, especially for Indigenous peoples through the different minerals. It's hard to understand because of we have to protect the environment, and we're also having impacts from the water in our lands. I'm sorry, the interpreter's having. The interpreter cannot hear with the mask. When we are having, because of the mining, species are disappearing because of the mines that are around us. We are trying to exercise our indigenous rights. The situation is, I'm sorry, the interpreter just cannot hear.
Momento, por favor. Momento, por favor. We're going to pause for a second.
I'm sorry, I need.
We aren't able to hear the interpretation. Could that be communicated through the Spanish channel to Jorge, that we can't hear his words clearly? So sorry to interrupt. If it's possible to speak closer to the microphone, if we could please share with Jorge, if we could ask him to speak closer to the microphone. The mask makes it very difficult to hear his words. And we're so excited to hear everything he has to say. So we apologize for introducing. Gracias.
Bueno, eso era mi presentación más que nada, mi presentación para...
It's a presentation to let you know that what we are doing.
Thanks for everyone for pausing for a minute. Are we ready to start again?
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm Jorge. I'm from the Atacama people in Atacama. We are being affected by the extraction of lithium and cobalt, and the government doesn't respect us and the law as far as indigenous peoples, in which we our communities are being affected, and what as indigenous communities from the Salar de Atacama, it's affecting our crops. It's affecting our water, and I'm sorry, the interpreter's having a very difficult time. And so, I'm sorry, I can't. I just want to say more than anything else that it also very grateful for this opportunity. And we send you warm greetings. And hopefully we can do something against this mining industry, which is affecting the indigenous peoples and the great peoples of Latin America. Thank you so much.
I want to say thank you to Don Alvarez and also to our interpreters for sharing that. And we know that the interpreting particularly is difficult in many of these rural areas, and the technology access is difficult. So we really appreciate your being with us today. And we'll also post some links about the work that is happening in the community that spokesperson Alvarez is working at this time, so that people can learn more about what's happening in this area. And because we have a few more minutes, let me also ask if we'd like to share a short video that further shows the important work that this community is doing. And maybe we'll take just a moment here for my colleague Neha to go to a Vimeo link that we have that that shows where Jorge's community is from, and that shows some of the framing that they're taking towards working on these difficult mining issues around lithium extraction in a very sensitive environment with a community that's very dependent on agriculture. And no problems at all for the challenge with technology. It's wonderful just to be here today, and I'll pass it to Neha to start this video so we can hear more about what's happening in this community. Thank you. Go ahead, Neha.
If I can just jump in really quick.
Yes, please do, Emma.
I would like to say that this video is shot both in Chile and in Argentina, so it shows a little bit of the struggle that's happening in both of the places where Jorge and Clemente are from, and it's been shot by a filmmaker named Taylor Free Solo Reese.
Son tubos de agua, de arriba de la que sacan de las lagunas, de la cordillera, el agua que traen para procesar el litio. Da pena de como a uno le estuvieran sacando la sangre. Es como el que está la madre tierra, la pata joiri, y le estén extrayendo la sangre igual que un ser humano.
Y nuestra como visión es respetar la madre tierra. Yo no digo esta tierra me pertenece, yo digo yo le pertenezco a esta tierra. Y mientras yo la tenga, la voy a cuidar, la voy a trabajar, la voy a hacer producir, que me va a servir para mi sustento. Y el día que nosotros perdamos ese pensamiento, yo creo que nuestro pueblo va a desaparecer.
Esta es una bomba donde bombean agua del núcleo. Estaban a 80, 100 metros, pero ahora las nuevas empresas dicen que quieren perforar a 400 metros. Esta es una. Cada vez se va bajando más lo que es la salmuera hacia abajo. Con la empresa del litio, con estos autos eléctricos, dicen que como que se va a salvar el planeta y no creo que se vaya a salvar el planeta. Yo creo que esto, si queremos un cambio, tiene que partir de nosotros, de ser más ser humanos, de ser más hermanables, más hermanos y juntarlos. Pues. Con la plata no es nada. El agua sí, el agua, si no tenemos agua no sobrevivimos, pero no todo es plata. Algún día se van a acabar los recursos naturales y vamos a quedar sin nada. Ya ahí no va a valer ni los teléfonos, no van a valer ni los autos, va a valer nosotros como personas. Cuando llegaron las mineras, hace como 50 años atrás, el litio no era muy importante. Y después con esto, cuando viene ya el boom de la tecnología, que vienen los computadores, los celulares, todos con baterías de litio, esto agarra vuelo. Empezamos a luchar por el agua, que los robaban el agua, lagunas milenarias que estaban, que desaparecieron. Y ahí donde nosotros reaccionamos de que tenemos que ser consultados como pueblos originarios, que somos dueños del territorio y que esto nos pertenece, y que no, a cambio de la tecnología, a cambio de los autos eléctricos, no podemos desaparecer. Somos tan seres humanos como la gente que está en otros países y tenemos el derecho a vivir y a vivir en paz y en armonía.
Nadie desconoce ni cuestiona el reclamo que ustedes están haciendo. Lo que se le está cuestionando es, para ejercer su derecho, ustedes están vulnerando el derecho de otras personas.
No solamente una lucha de hace 2 o 3 días, nosotros venimos hace varios años con tema litio y ahora al no tener respuesta nos vemos obligados a tomar estas medidas, porque es el único lenguaje que entienden los gobiernos, lamentablemente.
No tenemos ninguna denuncia ni registro de disminuciones de agua de lo que ustedes están planteando ahora.
Yo creo que entre nosotros tenemos que luchar hasta el último por cada gota de agua, porque otra vez nosotros vienen nuestros hijos, nietos, y ahí nosotros no podemos dejarlos sin agua, se pierde toda una cultura.
Entonces nosotros por eso hemos pedido una asamblea, hemos pedido que venga el que es el responsable y que tenga la respuesta clara y para toda esta gente.
Yo creo que lo mejor es contactar al gobernador y que digan qué día y a qué hora va a estar presente acá en la asamblea de las comunidades.
Si ustedes levantan la medida de fuerza, acordamos una fecha para que el gobernador venga. Si no hay levantamiento de la medida de fuerza, el gobernador no va a venir.
No, a partir de hoy no. No nos interesa el litio. ¿Por qué? Porque nos violaron todo el derecho. Y ahora nosotros decimos no. La palabra dice no al litio. No al litio.
esto tiene que quedar para las futuras generaciones. Y como lo dejaron nuestros abuelos, nosotros queremos dejarlo a nuestros niños, a futuras generaciones que vean lo hermoso y lo importante que es para sobrevivir aquí en este desierto.
Es un todo. Es un todo. Es un ciclo. Para nosotros la tierra es lo más sagrado. Que sin ella no existiría. Eso. Y yo pienso que si el mundo toma esa conciencia del hombre indígena, es la salvación del planeta.
Thank you so much to Jorge and Emma and also Clemente, who will be presenting next, for all the important work you're doing, and also for this video that we shared, and along with the link for where you can access that. And I'll answer one of the questions that we will have a recording available. So next I'll pass again to Emma Harrison from the Center for Interdisciplinary Environmental Justice to introduce the next speaker. Clemente Flores, over to you, Emma. Thank you.
Thanks. And just thank you to Taylor for producing that incredibly beautiful work, and to all of the people featured in that film for your really powerful words. And actually, it's a great introduction because the scenes of protest are actually from the community where Clemente is joining us from. So it's a great honor again to be able to introduce Clemente Flores, an Indigenous Cola person from El Moreno, the Cuenca de Salinas Grandes y Laguna Guayatoyoc in the Jujuy region of Argentina. Clemente, take it away.
Hola, buenas tardes.
Hello, good afternoon to everyone. Clemente Flores, and of the Salinas Grandes Basins and the Guayatayoc Lake in Argentina. And it's such a pleasure to be here with you. And then I'm so happy that you made this possible, that we will be able to put our voices up in defense of our water, of our resources, and that we've done much work in order to make this visible the problematic of the use of waters in the mining industry. And I'm from the province of Jujuy, and these are foreign companies that come and they come in, they take things away, and they just leave crumbs, hunger, destruction, and the waste of waters. And this document that I'm showing you in this presentation, and way in the background we have Salida Grande. It's a basin with 6,500 people, and we have many hectares of land in this territory where many living beings live, llamas and vicuñas and other livestock. And we've been working to defend the territory, the water, and not just not in lucha, but just knowing, also getting to know other communities like ours, and then Atacama, Atacama. Yeah, and we've done many presentations defending this territory and in solidarity with them. And there are many things we can show that our grandfathers left us, ways of living. This is about 3,500 meters above sea level. This is a place where the company came for the first time. In the next photo, please, how the this is where the companies came to buy the salt mine, the salt area, this Salar. And so, you know, we weren't aware of what was coming on us when they first came in. And could you go to the next slide, please? Next slide, please. Yes. This is the disaster that they leave behind. This is what happens when they come in mine. You know, they fill this with water, and then what's left behind after they evaporate the water. Go to the next one, please. These are the different types of meetings that we have in recognition of our territory, of seeing the community, that we are concerned. You know, there's some women, some young women there even. And these are the women that really are on foot and really fighting for us to continue forge ahead with our efforts. Next one. The meeting is not just training, but just recognitions, you know, all different types of meetings to see the territory belongs to us and to see how we can come together to defend it at different times. In winter, summer, within the classroom or outside in the plaza, where everyone can come. And we get together and we see and share with people what we're learning about this. Next. And these are pictures of recognition of the territory of the salt mine, the salt areas when it didn't have water anymore. That people were looking for the resources and are no longer there, and walking to see hectares of our territory. And the place in the summer, this fills with water, this whole lithium salt area, because they're the people that live from the water. And then, you know, this is an element of life for our communities, and you know, and this is where the salt is produced, and that's where life is produced as well. And this is produced with the exchange of communities. So, and also, and this gives us the food, the sustenance, so we can survive as a community. Next one. This is really important when we have struggles or fights with the movement, to be able to show you to not just the country, but it's not that we didn't know. We want to make visible these issues, and many people that are going by the road and letting them know what was happening. We were just going there to check out the salt air mounds, but we were letting them know, because they didn't know, they had never interpreted what this was for, and how the exploitation of the same looked. It was causing an ecological disaster that was that was bad for the community itself. And here we say we don't eat batteries. If they take the water away, we will lose our life, or life will be lost. Next. This is a very photo of a moment that we had of justice, of Argentine justice, where we went to talk with the judges, and they said that there was nobody living in Cuna, but you know, the equation for us was to make ourselves visible, make our community visible, because the state couldn't say there was no communities there. you know, there was more than 33 communities in that whole territory, and that were and they were all representing it in that picture, you know. We wanted them to hear and to feel and know that we were present and that we existed. So we that they just can't step over the rights we had it as a community is what we brought to their attention. From here, it's really important. Go to the next one, please. You know, as of here, we needed to see how we could work in the Salar. The salt, this is for human consumption, and this is the work of the salt areas. But you know, we wanted to say that we needed to work on what was our rights for our communities, that we had our own constitution. The indigenous rights is mainly what we're talking about, like how we could go forge ahead to be able to create documents to protect our rights. That helps us a lot. So not just our communities, but the support institutions like OIT and local organization that supported us to have a pact for nature and the help in the community effort and the protection of humans. So these are the rights and how we could see who was violating the rights of the communities. We are very concerned that yes, that the territory could be defended and make it something productive for us, and that we could show that to them so the communities could understand what is within this document that was drawn up. And we began to work on it and in consultation with the community. And so that we had something to support us. We had a legal tool that could be applied towards the communities, towards the nature that could bring, that we could, with which we could go ahead. But it's something that's difficult. Because together we are stronger and we will be able to carry this out. And we are wary of being able to bring this forth in a healthy fashion.
Son formas dentro de la.
So I'm talking about the protocol that are there for the communities and what can we do. And then it's called Coyo and salt footprints. The protocol that we need to fulfill, or we're going to have fulfilled over time, is the work of our organization, is to be able to talk to the minds and talk to them about the different agreements they have made with us. And we saw that we can make ourselves be heard and our agreements with the governments to be honored, and we need to do them again and put them in practice again. That's what we found, and that way we can help Kachi Waya Versa. So this is a part of the Salinas that is called Yalal, and it has salt, many salt rocks here that
Thank you very much. Are there any additional comments you would like to share today? If you would like to make any closing comments, that's wonderful. If not, we'll move on to the next presentation.
No, lo dejo para que después hagan las
I'll
preguntas.
just leave it here. Maybe later on, maybe they can ask questions, and maybe I can answer them later, perhaps.
That's a great point. We have a question and answer session at the end of the morning, and we appreciate so much your presentation and all of your work today, and everything that you brought to us. So thank you again. So with that, I'll pass on to the next presenter, who will be joining us from the US, from Silicon Valley, actually, and I'll invite Nate Ramos, if he's here, to share an introduction to Alexi Sagona and Isaac Ordonez. Over to you, Nate, and thank you, everyone.
Hello, thank you. I'm excited to introduce Alexi Sagona and Isaac Ordonez. Alexi is a member of the Amawitsan Tribal Band. He is a PhD student in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at the University of California, Berkeley. His research interests include indigenous environmental governance, collaborative research, and property rights. He is involved in the Amawitsan Youth Group and the Protect Her Stock campaign. Isaac Ordonez is a member of the Amawitsan Tribal Band as well. He is an Amawitsan Land Trust Native Steward, archaeological monitor, and a student at Cabrillo College. His interests include indigenous environmental stewardship and eco-archaeology. He is also an active member of the Amawitsan Youth Group and the Protect Her Stock campaign.
And I think we'll also have Isaac Ordonez, who's here today. Am I right? Is Isaac also co-presenting with you today, Alexi?
Yes, he is.
All right. Wonderful. And Nate, would you like to introduce Isaac as well at this time? I can also share his background, whatever is good for you.
Yeah, Isaac Ordonez is a member of the Amawitsan Tribal Band. He is an Amawitsan Land Trust Native Steward, archaeological monitor, and student at Cabrillo College. His interests include indigenous environmental stewardship and eco-archaeology. He is an active member of the Amawitsan Youth Group and the Protect Her Stock campaign.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nate, for that introduction. Nate's been a great advocate for our community, and we're so grateful for his hard work at Stanford. And thank you so much for the other panelists for sharing. It's an honor to be with you all today. And I'd just like to ask if we could get the slides put up right now, if that's possible. Great, thank you. So I'll be sharing a little bit in the beginning, and then I'll be passing it over to Isak later. And we will be discussing an Indigenous rights issue here in Santa Clara County in the San Francisco Bay Area. Next slide, please. I would like to start out by sharing something from a recent interview I had with Amamutsun member Alicia Moniz. In this interview, Alicia discussed how when her daughter was little, they would spend weekends tending and gathering plant materials for food, craft, and medicine. And after a number of weeks, her daughter began to really enjoy these excursions on the weekends and would plead with her mom, "Mom, can we go to Indian World? I want to go to Indian World this weekend." And so for their family, located in urban Bay Area setting, practicing culture meant having to travel outside of this urban sprawl into the natural landscapes of South Santa Clara County and Central California in Amamutsun territory. And really for this Indian world to exist, as the daughter was saying, you need the suitable material conditions, which have the important food, medicinal, and basketry resources that are present. And for Ohlone peoples here in the Bay Area, development of natural lands really pose a threat to these few remaining spaces where this Indian world can exist. Next slide, please. And so I want to tie this into the ongoing issue at Uristock, which is near Gilroy, California. Uristock means place of the big head dance in the Mutsun language, and is an important sacred site to our tribe. It's known as a place of power, as noted in this quote by our tribal historian and vice chair, Ed Ketchum. And although the land has been owned by settlers since 1803, and gathering rights and access rights for community members have not been present for nearly a century, its preservation as a natural space continues to benefit community members because it is a place of power, even if they cannot physically access it right now. Next slide, please. And there's a new development proposal that intends on developing 320 acres of Uristock to build a sand and gravel mine. And this mining operation, is understood to be financially lucrative because of these rare geologic conditions at this place. And it'll provide these materials that are needed to create infrastructure in the growing Silicon Valley region, because there's an increase of demand for this. And so here you can see on the map, on the bottom left, where Uristock is, just at the bottom of Santa Clara County. And so for the tribe, the value of Uristock is in its preservation and stewardship. But for developers, these rare geological features suggest that it has unique economic assets if it is mined. And the community, our community, envisions a different future for the land, not with sand and gravel mines, but instead involving environmental restoration and stewardship, and bringing back ceremonies to Uristock. The tribe, we have a land trust, and it has the Native Stewardship Corps, which is a group of young adult tribal members, such as Isak, who are trained in natural resource management. And they are the embodiment of this vision to restore the native environment and ecosystem, and also restoring culture at the same time. And so I'll be passing it now to Isak to share more about our campaign, and as well as the experiences he has participating in this Native Stewardship Corps. Go ahead, Isak.
Thank you, Alexi. Let's see. Can you see me?
You look great, Isak. Thanks.
Oh, okay.
today.
Sorry. Okay.
No, so happy to have you. Thank you.
Thank you. So, the tribe is actively opposing the mining permit application and working to sway opinions of the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors. In 2019, the community hosted a walk for Eurostock, where nearly 400 people, allies, and community members walked 5 miles from San Juan Bautista foothills to the foothills of Eurostock. In 2020, we had a smaller event due to the pandemic, where tribal youth conducted the walk for the community. The campaign has also created a coalition of supportive organizations, which has helped get the message out about the campaign. Given the environmental consequences of the project, the tribe has also formed alliances with environmental organizations interested in protecting this land due to it being a critical wildlife corridor and habitat for the California tiger salamander and red-legged frog. Next slide, please. I will now be sharing a little bit about our ongoing land stewardship project at Quito State Valley, where we are restoring coastal grassland habitat. Being able to be a part of this project as a native steward and working alongside fellow Mootsons has been rewarding and inspiring, especially being able to see our progress and influence firsthand. Land stewardship opportunities are important for connecting ourselves to ancestral lands, since our tribe does not hold any land of its own, unfortunately. Restoring landscapes benefits me personally, not only because I get to see the progress and effects, but also knowing that we are continuing what our ancestors started through their stewarding of the land. This work provides a sense of belonging through our community with other tribal members, knowing that our hard work all leads back to the common goal of restoring Mother Earth. Coming out of high school, I didn't have much direction career-wise. I was luckily then given the opportunity to work alongside the Native Stewardship Corps, which has now given me a strong sense of direction of what I want to do with my life and how I can also contribute to something much bigger than myself. We hope to have our own land in the future, and ownership of Eurostock would be significant and ownership of Eurostock is part of that vision. Eurostock is significant for ceremony, healing, as well as helping us preserve our feeling of belonging and identity. Next slide, please. The Amamutsan Land Trust has recently acquired access to several acres adjacent to Quito State Valley and San Mateo County, with the goal in mind of plant propagation. We have constructed a greenhouse at the property, which has a capacity of housing a few 100,000 seedlings. The tribe intends on restoring coastal grasslands by propagating over 160,000 native plants, with many of them going directly into Quito State Valley. Many plants are culturally important for the community, such as yarrow, wavy soakroot, red maize, California brome, and coast tarweed. Once restored, the community will be able to gather and harvest these resources without damaging the ecosystems. This project is a perfect example of how Amamutsan stewardship benefits non-human life as well as the tribal community. Restoring land and restoring culture go hand in hand, and the community is well prepared to restore the traditional ecology, traditional human residence, and ceremonies to Eurostock. Next slide, please. So to conclude, I would like to highlight the central points of this presentation. First, healthy landscapes and access rights are needed to practice culture. Development of a sand and gravel mine in Eurostock compromises our idea of preserving Eurostock as an area of where our culture can continue in the future. And not only do we reject the mining of our sacred lands, our community also offers a better alternative, as seen in our ongoing land stewardship projects. Traditional ecological knowledge and stewardship can help restore Mother Earth. But Silicon Valley development pressures threaten our livelihoods and spirituality, and we need to protect natural lands for the well-being of our culture. The local demand for infrastructure materials has fueled the push to mine Eurostock. Finally, as we have discussed, our community believes Eurostock is important as a place of power, as well as a home for our non-human relatives, and that these perspectives are not concerned about the monetary value of the land. So we believe the value of sacred land should not be about its value as a commodity. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac. Thank you, Alexi, for that inspiring presentation and for your stewardship work. I want to thank all the panelists from this morning for all of your work, and also for sharing your expertise in these areas, particularly with this audience, this diverse audience that we have of researchers and students and technologists and engineers and activists. Thank you to everyone for being here today. We are now concluding the first session of the symposium. We'll get a 10-minute break at this time. I want to acknowledge the work that people have been doing behind the scenes also, all the volunteers, students, making things run. So we'll take a 10-minute break, and during the break, one thing we can invite you to do is to participate in a solidarity action. All of the groups that have presented today are doing extremely important work in partnership with others. And I'll share three things. First, a sign-on letter to sign on in solidarity with Batani Fund and the Aborigen Forum Coalition and Indigenous Peoples of Russia. Second, a petition to Santa Clara County, especially for those of us who live in Santa Clara County, who are constituents, to protect Mutsun sacred grounds from the proposed quarry. And third, to support Indigenous communities of Salinas Grande and Laguna Guayatayoc in Argentina. We have another link here that offers some opportunities there. And if I'm missing something, I'll invite panelists to include other action items in the chat for panelists. So with that, we'll take a 10-minute break. We'll reconvene at 10:30, where we'll have a second panel where we're talking about tools that are drawing on the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples for free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples when development may be occurring on their lands or affecting their communities. So I'll invite you to get a cup of coffee, get some water, walk around, take a break, and we'll see you again at 10:30. Thank you, everyone. All right, we're at 10:30, so I'm welcoming everyone back to the room for the second half of the symposium. Thanks for being with us from many, many places, Chile, Argentina, Russian colleagues who are here in the States, and other places. So this is our symposium on Indigenous leadership in the emerging green economy, mining, Silicon Valley, and global environmental justice. And we're going to get going again in just a minute with our next set of speakers. Let everyone get settled. Okay. Great. And if people are just popping on for the second half of the event, I'll share the background here in the chat and reshare that. We had a wonderful morning with Indigenous leaders sharing their experiences and their expertise with us. And I'm excited to move to our next session now regarding tools for engagement with some of these issues, in particular tools for advancing a just transition and talking about free, prior, and informed consent. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker in this session, Galina Angarova. Galina Angarova is a representative of the Ijarit Nation of the Buryat Peoples, a Russian indigenous group. She's also executive director of Cultural Survival, which is an indigenous-led NGO advocating for the rights of indigenous peoples. I'll share Galina's full bio so that if you weren't here during the first opening, you'll know how much expertise she has to share with us today. Previously, Galina worked for a private philanthropy that supports indigenous communities globally through grants and technical support. Prior to that, she represented the Indigenous Peoples Major Group at the UN on Sustainable Development Goals and the post-2015 Development Agenda, and also led Indigenous experts to review safeguards for Indigenous peoples. And she did that for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change's Green Climate Fund. She has also worked as a Russian program director at the San Francisco-based NGO Pacific Environment, where she organized direct actions against large resource extraction projects in Siberia and the Russian Far East. And finally, I'll note that Galina holds a master's degree in public administration from the University of New Mexico, and also her bachelor's of arts in linguistics and teaching methodology from the Buryat State University in Ulan-Ude in the Russian Federation. Welcome, Galina. I know we'll have some slides to share. We can start those slides now, and I'll turn it over to you, Galina. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you, Sybil. Thank you again for your generous introduction in organizing this important event and bringing people, academics, and students and stakeholders to this conversation. I'm really grateful to be a presenter, someone who's done a lot of work in the field of Indigenous rights on the grassroots level, organizing communities and stakeholders around large resource extraction projects, and participating in the FPIC processes, not only in Russia and other parts of the world as well. I'm also here with Kate Finn, who is an amazing ally, an Indigenous woman, the executive director of the First Peoples Worldwide, who will be co-sharing that experience and information about one of the most important tools for Indigenous people, such as free, prior, and informed consent. So as I mentioned earlier today, it is important more than ever to build solidarity. and a community of Indigenous leaders and our allies to make sure that this transition to the green economy centers justice and equity, abides to the principles of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, of UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and respects Indigenous people's self-determination and free, prior, and informed consent. It is important today to build that awareness among all of our Indigenous communities and our allies, share information, provide mutual education, build solidarity, and strategize together. And I think this is one of the reasons, it is one of the reasons why we're here. So I'll begin the slides show with the first one on meeting the Paris Agreement's targets, which may send demand skyrocketing for critical minerals used to produce clean energy technologies. A recent report published by the International Energy Agency states that meeting the Paris Agreement's climate targets will skyrocket these demands, and the figures are absolutely daunting. For the raw materials used to manufacture electric vehicles, by 2040, the forecasts that for lithium will have increased 42 times relative to 2020 levels. A new World Bank Group report finds that the production of minerals such as graphite, lithium, and cobalt would increase by nearly 500% by 2050 to meet the growing demand for clean energy technologies. It estimates that over 3 billion tons of minerals and metals will be needed to deploy wind, solar, and geothermal power, as well as energy storage required to achieve a below 2-degree future. Please take a moment and try to picture that. We don't even know what 3 billion tons look like. And the most important question we need to answer here, where will those 3 billion tons of minerals be mined? How much water will it take? What will be the impacts of the environment on the environment and the local communities? So next slide. Our friends at Earthworks, who have been working on these issues of transition or so-called critical or so-called green energy minerals, have done tremendous research in the past few years. They have recently published a report called Recharge Responsibly. It shares that in a 100% renewable energy future, demand would reach 136% of the documented nickel deposits that are currently economically feasible to extract, 280% for lithium, and 426% for cobalt. The skyrocketing demand for these minerals is driving the expansion of mining in geographical hotspots throughout the world, with disproportionately negative impacts in the global south, and especially Indigenous peoples. And there's tremendous overlap between mining sites for these minerals and Indigenous peoples' lands. There are some statistics specific to the United States, for example, from a recent study by the market analysis firm MSCI. Many of the remaining untapped deposits of the metals critically needed for the US energy transition from fossil fuels are located either near or within areas of cultural and environmental importance to Native Americans. Among these key energy transition minerals, 90% of nickel, 89% of copper, and 79% of lithium, and 68% of cobalt reserves and resources are in the US, are located within 35 miles of Native American reservations. Mining companies have already faced opposition of mine development in many of these areas, reflecting the heightened risk to companies and investors arising from these conflicting priorities. Given the steep projected demand curve for these minerals, intervention at an early stage in their development is absolutely necessary. And one of the ways to ensure such interventions occur is through applying the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. So I just wanted to stop here, and I just wanted to ask Kate to continue with the presentation on free, prior, and informed consent.
Thank you, Galina. Thank you so much for all of your work. Thank you so much for the way that you hold space for Indigenous peoples and that you use your intellect, time, and talent to forward the rights of Indigenous peoples every day. My name is Kate Finn. I'm the Executive Director of First Peoples Worldwide, which is a program out of the University of Colorado at Boulder. And our role is to forward corporate accountability to the rights of Indigenous peoples. I'm honored to be invited to present to you all on the topic of FPIC. So with that, I will begin here. So what is FPIC? FPIC is free, prior, and informed consent. And what does it do? It safeguards the human rights of Indigenous peoples. It also provides opportunities for equity and decision-making and participation as to development that impacts the resources of Indigenous peoples. And I want to make one thing very clear. By resources, we mean lands and territories, mineral resources, agriculture, aquaculture resources, but we also mean cultural resources. We mean the intellectual property, the property that artisans produce every single day. All of these resources are Indigenous peoples, and FPIC is the safeguard that allows Indigenous peoples to control and decide how their property and their resources will be best used. So what does this mean for you? When you operationalize free, prior, and informed consent, it gives Indigenous leaders the opportunity to participate in development plans and development design, but it gives you, in your role as in the tech sector, in any sector that you sit in as an investor, to understand what the perspective of Indigenous peoples are and what your impact on those resources will be. So as you heard earlier, that many Indigenous peoples have ancestral, cultural, spiritual ties to their land and resources that go beyond, far beyond the economic uses of that land. And they're vital to cultural heritage, and they're vital to the modern practices that bind our communities together. So let's be clear. This is about preserving, protecting, and respecting Indigenous peoples around the world. So let's move just into a little bit more about what FPIC is. So as you heard before, we had a wonderful presentation from Don Clemente and others. What are the rights of Indigenous peoples and how do we caption them? So first off, Indigenous rights are human rights. And the best way to think of, to look at, and to understand the rights of Indigenous peoples is to look at the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Through this instrument, all of the rights afforded to Indigenous peoples as humans and their individual and collective entities are framed and well stated. So this declaration is the universal framework of minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples around the world. You'll hear a lot about the UNDRIP, or the declaration, because this is the standard that Indigenous peoples use around the world. There are many countries who say they have adopted the UNDRIP or who have UNDRIP principles written into their laws. It's my experience that when a country, whether it be the United States, whether it be in the global South, adopts the UNDRIP, they don't adopt it fully. and they certainly don't adopt FPIC fully. So when you are thinking about FPIC, the way that Indigenous peoples think about FPIC is using the UNDRIP as the standard, as the gold standard and your North Star. So you'll hear me refer to this multiple times in the presentation because this is the best way that FPIC can be understood, both on a business side, but also when you walk into an Indigenous community, I can almost guarantee this is what they're thinking when it comes to FPIC. So why is FPIC important to companies? We heard that it's important to Indigenous peoples because it provides opportunities for equity, decision-making, and negotiating power at the table, opportunities that frankly Indigenous peoples haven't had in the past. There have been very few ways that Indigenous peoples have been able to articulate the impact of mining and extractive industries on their lands, territories, and resources, and frankly, very little opportunities to articulate other impacts. What goes on with the community? What does the local economy look like before and after extractive industries come in? These are all questions that need to be brought forth. But let's talk now about why is FPIC important to companies? The first is that FPIC is the key to a social license to operate. So a social license to operate refers to ongoing acceptance of a company or industry's standard business practices and operating procedures by its employees, stakeholders, and the general public. So a social license to operate is created and maintained slowly over time as a company or investor builds trust with the community that it operates in. In order to build this social license to operate, companies are encouraged to do the first right thing. And when it comes to Indigenous communities, that's building a relationship based on the principles of free, prior, and informed consent. You'll see here that the top 10 business risks that are facing mining and minerals companies today are all ranked. Number one, and having climbed in the last few years, is a social license to operate. Because what happens when there's no social license to operate? Social conflict. Social conflict happens. Human rights violations may happen. Environmental degradation may happen. When all of these things are not taken into account, there's social conflict. There can be legal conflict. There can be legal and political delays. There can be a lot of different risks to a company, to a business, and to an investor that may delay the project, that may make the project never happen, and that frankly will impact their bottom line. So business risk, of course, can occur in a variety of ways, and one of them is when there is no social license to operate. According to a study a few years ago, the study showed that for a world-class mining operation, there's a cost somewhere between $20 million and $30 million a week when there are operational delays caused by communities. This is when communities have not given their consent, when they have not asked or allowed for a company to come onto their lands. There are delays. There's social conflict, as I said before, and there's legal delays, and that can cost a company quite a bit of money. Another piece of research that we saw that came out of the Wharton School of Business found that investors that have projects near Indigenous land claims experience between a 60 to 160% increase in material risk events. So what does that mean? That's an increase in lawsuits. That's an increase in regulatory inquiries. That's an increase in labor-related actions. There's a lot of risk. Without that social license to operate, there's a lot of risk. And I would bring to you, given the stats that Galina brought to us earlier, that risk will only increase as time goes by. So I'd like to walk through now just a few of the main parts of FPIC, what it means, and then we'll get on to how to operationalize FPIC in your work. So what is free? Free means that consent is given voluntarily, and without coercion, manipulation, or intimidation. That the process is self-directed from the community from whom consent is being sought, and that consent is unencumbered by externally imposed expectations or timelines. This is a good time to remind everyone of the statistics and the information that was provided at the beginning of the day. Indigenous communities are diverse, and they are all over the world and operate differently. Indigenous governance is fascinating because it's so different. So when you go into a community, you will be learning and you will be asking, and you will need to learn what is the governance system of the Indigenous community there. What does free look like there? And how can I provide the information in that way? Prior. Consent is sought sufficiently in advance of any authorization or commencement of activities, and allows the time necessary for Indigenous peoples to undertake their own decision-making processes. What I see from my seat very often is that a company or investor, somebody will go in and ask the state for permission, go through a regulatory process as to an environmental screening or a feasibility study, something like that. The state says, yes, sounds good. And then at that point, and after that point, a company or an investor who knows that there are Indigenous peoples who may be impacted will go to the tribe and say, hey, this is happening. What do you think? But that's not prior. Prior is before the design process begins. Prior is before the routing of a pipeline. Prior is before, well before, when a business plan informed. Consent is properly solicited when Indigenous peoples have objective and accurate information related to the proposed activity. So what this also means is that FPIC needs to be resourced. Informed means that information is given in the language that is understood by Indigenous peoples, that can be read, understood, and articulated by Indigenous elders as by the youth. To do this, investors and companies and governments need to resource FPIC and need to understand what it means to put information in front of these communities. Consent. Consent is the collective decision made by the Indigenous peoples, which is reached through the customary decision-making processes. Consent may also be subject to conditions set forth by those Indigenous peoples. So this is consent. And the one thing that I would like to make very clear today is that consultation does not equal consent. FPIC, the whole body of FPIC, is a process. It's a process of deliberation. It's a process of decision-making, and it's a right. And as a right, Indigenous peoples have the right to say yes or to say no to development. And if we just think back just a little bit on those slides, the fact that Indigenous peoples could say no underscores each one of these tenets. If they're going to say no, wouldn't you as an investor or as a buyer or as an innovator want to know that far prior to building your product? Wouldn't it be better to know that way before when you're designing something as opposed to in the middle? It's important to understand this. And I want to say also that there is a lot of means and methods to consult with Indigenous peoples, to understand what they're thinking, to understand the connection to the environment, to understand their ancestral territories. But that's consultation, right? That's deliberation. That's conversation. It's not consent. And the act of consultation itself, the act of consulting, does not constitute consent. So I want to run through a couple things, and then what I'd like to do is open the floor for some questions through the Q&A box here before our time is up. One moment here. So again, consultation is open and collective deliberation, understanding viewpoints, understanding what's going on. This is a precursor to soliciting FPIC. This is not FPIC itself. Consultation encompasses the right of Indigenous peoples to fully participate and genuinely influence a decision-making process. When Indigenous peoples come forward with their own feasibility study, with their own valuation of the land and resources, is that being integrated into the plan in a meaningful way? Does the plan change? Is there opportunity for the plan to change? Can the supply chain move? That's what consultation results in. I want to note again that consultation must be aligned with international standards, not domestic standards, not company standards. What you'll find is that there are many companies who have FPIC standards. And let me be very clear. Many companies have made these standards. They're based on consultation. They are not based on consent. They are meant to create a deliberative process, but they don't provide for the option or the right for Indigenous peoples to say no. So, when you create an FPIC standard for your company, when you create an FPIC standard for your innovation, there's a couple of key factors. And one of them is make sure it aligns with international standards. Make sure you're taking into account the right of Indigenous peoples to say no. And make sure you understand what the domestic standards are in the country in which you're operating so that you can understand where and how Indigenous peoples will intersect with the regulatory processes. Again, I want to impress that consultation is not a single moment of contact. It's not a letter or a public hearing or a website, although those can be components of providing information. Consultation is a process of dialogue, and it's iterative. It can change over time. I've seen companies that have decision-making trees about when and how they will consult and what happens if Indigenous peoples say no at any given point. This is the thinking that we're asking for. It's a process of dialogue over the course of the entire project and how impacts are being understood and collected and then addressed and mitigated and respected. Again, full consent, conditional consent, or refusal of consent is given at the conclusion of a process of consultation, a full process of consultation. So how does this work? How do you operationalize FPIC? The first thing is to respect the FPIC protocols put forward by Indigenous peoples themselves. There are so many Indigenous governance systems around the world that have their own FPIC protocols. Take those and respect those. Build them into the design process, build them into your thinking, and understand what those are and respect those. That's number one. And more Indigenous peoples have these FPIC protocols. The second thing that I wanted to take a crack at here today, and I see our time ticking down a little bit, is to integrate free, prior, and informed consent into your own due diligence. So what does that mean? That means that if you do due diligence in the way that either a domestic regime or a standard corporate regime allows you, you will see this much of the social, environmental, and governance risks attendant to a project. If you can include free, prior, and informed consent, if you can include consideration of Indigenous peoples, you will crack that open and you will see the totality of the impacts and the risks associated with that project. And it starts with asking a lot of questions. Who are the Indigenous peoples in the area in which you are going to work? Are they legally recognized? Are they not legally recognized? Do they have land tenure? Do they not? Are there treaties that apply to land that was once theirs, even though in a modern day scenario, they only have this much land? Who lived there traditionally? Who is downstream? You know, let's not forget that many Indigenous communities are in fact marginalized populations. So even if, let's just say, the environmental feasibility study says that there's enough water running that an intake for a community won't be affected if there's an emergency. What if that's the only intake? What if that's the only water intake for that community? And what if there's no emergency plan? What happens then? You will know this if you can take a wide lens to due diligence and a wide lens to free, prior, and informed consent. And with that, I would like to invite Galina back into the presentation. I'm going to take just a moment to see if I can look at these questions that have come forward in the chat. Okay, so I am now going to look at the questions. All right.
Should I add text now or later? Okay, sounds good. Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Kate. This is such a rich and informative presentation, and I just wanted to add like a few things about FPIC on my end and reiterate a few things that you haven't already mentioned. One is that each element of free, prior, and informed consent has legal significance. Please don't skip that. That it has to be free, it has to be prior, and has to be informed, that people who you're reaching out to, they need to know the information about the proposed projects and have their self-determined decision-making within the community. And then I also wanted to reiterate all the risks associated with such an engagement. There's just a multitude of risks, and they need to be quantifiable for the companies, political, reputational, financial, and legal risks involved in any of these projects. And third, which you have mentioned, Kate, is the importance of community developed protocols. And I know that there are many examples. If you Google search, there are many examples of different FPIC protocols online, but it's important to know that the criticism is that a lot of these protocols are a little bit weak in their language, and that it's important to strengthen the language. And if community does the research on the available FPIC protocols, please do your research and develop your own language. Develop what works for you.
Can I just really quick add on to that, Galina, what you're saying? We had a question about why there hasn't been as much attention paid to ILO 169 and its obligation of prior consultation. Great catch. I appreciate that. Of course, there is an obligation there. I think what we have found with ILO 169 is that it is legally binding. It's a legally binding treaty in many countries. It's a bedrock and foundational principle. I know that the UNDRIP is not a legally binding treaty, but the reason that we point to UNDRIP as the standard is because it really is the best encapsulation of the rights of Indigenous peoples around the world. And not only is it the best encapsulation of all of their human rights, it really is the guiding standard. And when you walk into an Indigenous community, Indigenous peoples hold up the UNDRIP. That's what they hold up. So if you want to understand all of the impacts, if you want to understand, you know, how to, as Galina says, operationalize free, prior, and informed, and to know how to do all of that, the UNDRIP is the guiding standard. So you're absolutely correct, it's non-binding, but it is the minimum standard that Indigenous peoples use and that we can point to. And in terms of, you know, the business case, that's the way you're going to find out what the risks are and what the impacts are. And as you're designing metrics and measures to understand how your project is intersecting with Indigenous peoples, you know, use ILO 169, use the UNDRIP, use the FPIC protocols, even from other communities that you've found, to really take a hard look at how your work is intersecting. So good catch. It is UNDRIP is non-binding, but it's still the standard.
Mm-hmm. And Kate, you've done a lot of research. I remember that paper was released by the First Peoples Worldwide on FPIC, and there's a huge section about the soft law versus the hard law and how, like, actually soft law can be even more powerful sometimes, since even if it's non-binding. So I think I would recommend reading that section and maybe pasting that document. Like, it's an incredible document that has all of the information that pertains to free, prior, and informed consent. Yeah, and it's like my final point, actually, one before the final point, is just I wanted to talk about non-consent. I think that this is not being widely kind of discussed in our circles. Like, can we define what non-consent means and what no? Like, I watched this beautiful video, and no means no, you know? What does company do if they encounter non-consent? Are they able to step away from the project? And I think that we need to define that in our language that we are working with, you know, on the international level, and include them in the, you know, for all the performance standards like at the World Bank or Equator principles, because I think we need to really elevate the language and strengthen the language on free, prior, and informed consent, and provide the definition what non-consent means.
Absolutely. I think that's such an important point. And this is why we have so much fun working together, for everyone who gets to watch us on the panel. I agree that we do need to define non-consent. And I really think that it starts with companies and investors and outside entities understanding the meaning of prior.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it is. You know, it's building in this knowledge that no means no. You know, when we go out into the world and we explain consent, you know, it's pretty easy to understand on an individual level, right?
Yeah.
This is my body. This is my space. I get to define where my space is. I get to define who comes in, and I get to define when there's a violation. It's the same thing for the individual as for the collective. And so when Indigenous peoples define their space, they get to define who comes in or out, and they get to define when there's a violation. It's not up to anyone else or to the companies. And so I think it is really important, like you're saying, to put out what does non-consent look like and how do companies respond? Because no means no. And I see that there's a question about companies that violate rights. The company doesn't want to engage in dialogue and is not accountable to its own policies. Yeah, and I wish I had a more hopeful message. We're seeing this more and more. It's always been present, but it's kind of the worst of the worst, and they're getting desperate.
Yeah.
And I think that accountability is important when you're holding companies accountable to their own policies, but that's when we can start making a business argument, when we can start talking to banks, when we can start talking to investors, and we can say, listen, we know, we did the case study. When the Dakota Access Pipeline started, they estimated that pipeline would cost about $3.4 billion. That's what they said in 2014. They refused to listen to the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. They refused to listen to any of the other tribes that had interests in that area. Well, that pipeline ended up costing them more than $7 billion as of 2018. And the costs are still going. There's still a legal battle there. And actually more than 12 billion was spent because of people divesting from the banks and community costs as well. So there's a material bottom line effect when respect isn't paid to Indigenous peoples. And I think that's going to be more true and more true. And to your point again, Galina, I think Indigenous peoples around the world are seeing this and experiencing this and building solidarity towards what it means to work well with each other and to pressure companies to understand what FPIC really is.
Love it, love it. And Kate, again, I just want to reiterate the importance of shareholder advocacy for Indigenous peoples. When we have the opportunity of direct contact with companies such as aforementioned BASF, Credit Suisse, UBS, Tesla, and others, that we are able to talk directly to these companies and express our concerns. You know, and in these concerns, as you mentioned, you know, you gave a beautiful analogy with your body, right? But for Indigenous peoples, it's not just an analogy, it's like the truth. You're living on your land and you perceive the land not as a object. You actually perceive it as a part of yourself, you know, as a collective part of self. So I think it's such an important analogy. I wanted to give one final point of a good example of, like, most probably important examples of Indigenous peoples and free, prior, informed consent, which actually just happened this week, right? Last week. The Maya people of southern Belize have led decades of work in Belize towards implementing their land rights and their right to free, prior, and informed consent. And just this week, the Supreme Court of Belize ruled to uphold the Maya people's right to FPIC and ordered the state to pay $3.12 million in compensation for land taken to expand the road and build a border checkpoint without their consent. Although it has not been an easy process, and currently they are continuing to face challenges in the process, their work represents one of the most compelling and complete examples of efforts to establish a functional and legitimate FPIC process for Indigenous peoples and by Indigenous peoples. And our friends at the Maya Leaders Alliance, they have created the protocols. They have led the process on their own. So the goal and the purpose of our organizations, First Peoples Worldwide and Cultural Survival, is actually bringing those examples and build capacity within Indigenous communities globally to be able to do to do this and lead the processes themselves. So just wanted to share that. Very excited.
Yes, I'm with you. I'm so excited we get a moment to celebrate this together. We haven't had a chance to do that, and it's such an amazing protocol. And I guess I'll make the final point, and I know we're coming up on time, is also, you know, Indigenous peoples are building capacity. They have protocols. We're there now. And transition minerals, this, as Galina said at the beginning of this presentation, this is happening fast. This is happening fast. And so investors, innovators, those who are working with Indigenous peoples, this is the time to think about this now. If you want to change the paradigm from extracting resources from Indigenous peoples to a moment of regenerative economy and understanding what the impact is to Indigenous peoples, the time is now. Implementing FPIC due diligence needs to happen now so that you don't end up having these social conflicts and really just continuing these divisive and colonial paradigms into the future. So I would just say there's a couple questions in the chat here that are wonderful questions about, you know, how do you understand a particular Indigenous people's approach to stewardship? How do you understand who to speak to when you approach an Indigenous community? How do you think about collective consent versus consent from a government? Those are really good questions. These are great questions, and I would just urge you to do your research. What is the governance system of the Indigenous peoples on the land that you're going to be? Ask them questions. Go to the governance system. Go to them, ask questions, understand what's going on, Don't let those questions hold you back. Do your research, understand what it is, because what I see a lot of times is companies that say, you know, we want consent, but we don't know who from, or one person says yes and one person says no. Indigenous peoples are diverse. The goals of different tribes and governments are different. But what you can do is talk with Indigenous governments, ask them for their FPIC protocols, and work through a process of understanding so that you know what the impacts of what the footprint for your project will be now and into the future. So with that, I will stop the slideshow here and turn the microphone back to Sybil. Thank you, Sybil.
Thank you so much, Galina and Kate. That was so much work that you're doing and such incredible expertise and knowledge that you're sharing with us. Thank you very much. And I want to also respond to an earlier question that we'll have these resources available for the audience and also recordings so that you can access some of the documents and some of the ideas. So thank you for that. And we'll move now into the final segment of the symposium, which is a question and answer session that will be chaired by Ella Norman and Ragini Srinivasan. We're so thrilled to have you here today and also to have your help with organizing this symposium and bringing together members of the Sunrise Movement and also young professionals in tech right here from the Bay Area who are really interested in some of these issues. And so I'll just share their bios for the audience so that you can know what good hands we're in. So Ella Norman is an undergraduate student at Stanford University and a member of the Stanford Environmental Justice and Human Rights Lab. She's also a member of the Silicon Valley Sunrise Coalition. And Ragini Srinivasan is an incoming second-year undergraduate at UCLA, studying mathematics, economics, and political science. She's from San Jose, where she's one of the leaders for the Silicon Valley chapter of the Sunrise Movement. And the Sunrise Movement, if you don't already know, is a national youth-led movement that focuses on climate and environmental justice, with an emphasis on political advocacy, electoral work, and grassroots community organizing nationwide. So thank you for joining us, and I'll leave it to you to share some comments on how these community-led presentations and also some of the tools with EPIC link up to your community here in the Bay Area. Thank you both.
Thank you, Sybil, for that introduction, and thank you to all of the presenters who have shared with us so far today.
So as we mentioned earlier, we are from Sunrise Silicon Valley, and the Sunrise Movement is a national youth-led movement that focuses on climate and environmental justice, and we are kind of based all throughout Silicon Valley or South Bay.
And many of us are joining in today from the Bay Area and Silicon Valley, which are places that are driving demand for materials such as nickel, lithium, and gravel for low carbon technologies and infrastructure. However, the technology needed to meet the demands of a low carbon economy should not come at the expense of environmental degradation or harm to human life. I hope that all of us keep these considerations in mind moving forward. With that being said, we're honored to be facilitating the Q&A section today. And at this time, I ask the presenters to turn on their cameras for gallery mode, and audience members feel free to use the Q&A feature to ask questions to the presenters. And if the question is for a particular presenter, feel free to mention that as well.
So we're getting a lot of questions, especially in the Q&A, and we also have some questions that people submitted before, so we'll try our best to get through as many as we can. First, we have a question for Galina and Kate regarding the Green New Deal. For those of you who don't know, the Green New Deal is a proposal in the US to achieve 100% clean and renewable energy by 2030, guarantee living wage jobs for anyone who needs one, and provide a just transition for both workers and frontline communities within the next decade. So our question is, how can Green New Deal policies be accountable to global considerations such as the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. If Galina, you want to start, and then Kate, that would be great.
It's a complicated question. Thank you so much. I think it has to be done in consultation with Indigenous peoples first and foremost. It has to be done with inclusion of some articles of the UN Declaration, or referenced at least in the document to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and prioritizing the implementation of free, prior, and informed consent. Absolutely. And again, like we've talked extensively about FPIC earlier, and I think that definitely needs to be prioritized in the document. I will take a moment to think a little bit more, and maybe Kate can add a little to that.
Yeah, so I absolutely agree with Galina, and I think, you know, in some ways, we could see this moment as two different currents undercutting each other, right? A Green New Deal is meant to champion our environment and our climate, and to create a healthy place for us all to live in. But at what cost? And what we are saying is that the cost will be very dear for Indigenous peoples if that is the only consideration. So I think what we need to see in the Green New Deal, and in many different policies in many different parts of the world, is an opportunity to change the way we do business. It is an opportunity to integrate FPIC. It's an opportunity for businesses to be accountable to their own standards on community governments and community governance and community consultation. It's an opportunity for the private sector to take the lead, and it's an opportunity. There is an FPIC provision in the Green New Deal, or was some months ago, and it's an opportunity to say, hey, this is about consent, not consultation. And I think if we can look at this together as an opportunity to disrupt past paradigms of extractive development, and by extractive, I mean not just the fossil fuel sector, but extractive in that we take from Indigenous peoples without ensuring the benefit to them. If we can take this moment, then I think we can do both. But I think what we're saying with transition minerals is it needs to be quick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I also wanted to add to that parallel to the Green New Deal, there's a initiative by the Biden-Harris administration. It's called 30 by 30. This initiative aims to secure 30% of marine and terrestrial surfaces, resources by the year of 2030. And while I think it might be a good opportunity, but it also kind of needs to respect Indigenous self-determination, put Indigenous leadership behind this goal, and resource Indigenous organizations, Indigenous-led organizations, tribes, groups, to support this effort. So I think it's parallel to that. It's very timely. The discussions are happening all over the native country. It's not only the US initiative, it's a global initiative. And Cultural Survival will be putting out a statement this week about the 30 by 30 initiative, and we'll be having a meeting with a number of Native leaders across the country to decide how it's going to work for Native people.
Thank you so much for your responses, Kate and Galina. Next, there are some questions for Clemente and Jorge. Through your experiences being Coyo and Tuhui, what does sustainability mean to you? Also, we mostly see lithium and these materials as resources for technology and roads, but can you speak on your relationship to the salts? Clemente, if you want to start.
Sobre el desarrollo.
Yeah, as far as the development, lithium, it's not development, it's extraction of water, and it's contaminating the water. Development is done in a different way. Development is sustainable. It should be pleasant. It should be good with what we're doing. And this, for example, we can see it in another way when there is a production, an agricultural production, it's good to the environment, it's concise, and whether it respects the water, and also the small scale cattle production is also done for wool and for meat. And so this is sustainable development. But on the other hand, lithium isn't, because it misuses the water, and 91% of the resources that are taken from there is going externally. It's not the development that the community wants. And we see that there's where we say that we speak about numbers in dollars. There are a lot of numbers that aren't even counted. We can't see how will this be administered. We'll just indebt us. And so this is not sustainable.
Thank you. Jorge, do you want to respond as well? If not, I think we can move on to the next question, Ragini.
Thanks, Ella. I think Jorge might just be in listening mode right now. So, but we can invite him to add if he would like to put something in the chat. Thank you. Back to you.
Okay, in the meantime, we can move on. Next, we have a question for Pavel. Can you talk about the struggles with greenwashing and corporate reforms that only check boxes without delivering real change? And what can different stakeholders along the supply chain do to support your efforts, including people who work in or with tech companies?
Кеша, все, да, вот в этом вопрос был. Да, я хотел бы попросить, можно еще раз повторить вопрос?
Could you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Yes, so what are the struggles with the greenwashing and corporate reforms that don't deliver real change? And what can different stakeholders along the supply chain do to support your efforts, especially people in tech companies?
Ну, да, вообще, конечно, эта тема вот гринвошинга, конечно.
Yes, of course, greenwashing. I would compare this problem to corruption and the processes of corruption. I think those are related processes. They're based on lies. They promote one set of goals, but what we see in reality are actions that take us farther from that goal in the opposite direction. The struggle with greenwashing can be only based on transparency, openness, and honesty. All these companies, and I won't name them, but unfortunately, greenwashing doesn't affect just government-based companies or big businesses. But unfortunately, if you look at the NGO sector, non-governmental organizations are also affected by greenwashing. And we need these processes to be transparent and open. We need every stage of their work and their business structures. They have to be accountable to public scrutiny of some kind. And if you talk about indigenous affiliated organizations or companies, then they have to be accountable to indigenous communities they represent. If you look at what's happening now with greenwashing, yes, there are a lot of deals that happen under the table, and this affects the public sector and companies and NGOs. But we have to uncover these processes. We have to publicize information about them. We have to make sure that the public has access to this type of information. And this way, any indecent action by a company or government can be scrutinized and made aware for the public. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, there's a question for Alexi. How can researchers and research contribute to protecting Indigenous lands and sovereignty?
That's a great question, and I'm sure many others can talk about it as well. But I guess from my experience, I've found a lot of benefits of spending a lot of time asking questions and not coming in with assumptions or ideas in mind of what I want to do with community-based research. For example, my research colleague, Annie Taylor, and myself have spent the last year doing an elder interview project where we've interviewed about 15 people for a few hours each and just asking what we can do and, you know, just having conversations and also developing trust. For a lot of people in academia, scholars, there's a bad history of university exploitation of Indigenous communities. And so it's always good to build trust before moving forward. Sometimes it's difficult when there are pressures to publish or, you know, look good for the university, but you have to prioritize the needs of Indigenous communities first, and then your research and your career goals and all of that comes second. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Alexi. Next, we wanted to ask another question to Clemente. What traditional agricultural and horticultural practices have been most affected as a result of mineral and groundwater extraction? Maybe Clemente and then Jorge as well.
If the translator could share that Clemente is currently muted.
Clemente ahorita está, oh, one moment.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you so much. So you were saying, you know, you're talking about the well, it produced that water. There's not enough water that we used to have for pasture and that we used to have for agriculture because of, and for our sheep. So it's very damaging it, and you can notice that this is occurring in our region, and that's why we're concerned about the water. The water tables have gone down. Did I make myself understood?
No, that's correct. And we were wondering, how has this affected different traditional agricultural practices?
En estos últimos años bajaron la producción.
Well, after that, after a year of production went way down, that we used to have potatoes And we're trying to solve this issue, where we can get some more water, because so we need to recuperate water for our planting areas. We need to recuperate it. This is happening because of climate change, but we know that the fact that we're losing water in that zone has a lot to do that. There's different wells that were measured in August of last year, and it had 50, and now it has it's even 50-60% of water. The water levels have gone down, so we're losing production in the different and then in the different zones that used to be irrigated by the water. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Next, there's a question from the Q&A to Pavel, asking about the status of the campaign against Tesla, and if the appeal to Elon Musk has gone anywhere, and if there has been any response from him or his company about Nornickel.
Да, спасибо за этот вопрос. Да, ответ от Тесла был. У нас...
Thank you for this question. We had negotiations with the Tesla company. I would call it positive for today, and we keep working with them. So if we keep moving in this direction, I believe we'll achieve success on the issues that set forth today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Sorry. Was there anything you wanted to add? Okay, otherwise we can move on. For Galina and Kate, how might we collaborate to address FPIC challenges in solidarity with Indigenous leaders? And also, what are some ways to ensure that consent is indeed based on collective consent?
Absolutely. So to the first part of the question is about how do we make sure we have consent? Is that right?
Yes. And then how can we address FPIC challenges with Indigenous leaders?
Absolutely. So the one thing I would say, well, there's several things I would say. Talk about this all day, so we could have a long conversation. When you are thinking about working with an Indigenous community, first ask, who are the leaders? Go in understanding who you're talking to. Ask for their FPIC protocols. Ask what's going on. It's your job to understand the land, the resources, and the territories. And to the extent that you can do that, you will be more prepared. Now, the other thing I would say as to collective consent, different communities are different. Different communities have different ways of reaching consent and understanding consent and where leadership will go. And it's not a company's job, an innovator's job, or a government's job to say how things need to be and whether they need to be in a particular way. It is simply your job to understand that whether the community has said yes or no, and to act accordingly. And I know that that's not a very satisfying answer because it's not a check the box answer, but this is not a check the box activity. So it's developing your ability and really resourcing FPIC and resourcing your strategy so that you can understand whether you have a social license to operate, that begins and ends with FPIC. And really incorporating due diligence into every level of your organization is the way to do that. If you understand from the supply chain and from the sourcing side of your business to the materials and marketing to the C-suite, what FPIC is, and there's a common understanding of what that is, you will find partnership with Indigenous peoples to be easier, and you will find that you can accept a no and respect a no more easily because everybody knows what's going on. So I think integrating FPIC throughout your due diligence, throughout your company, vertically and horizontally is really the way to do it, and to allow Indigenous leaders to speak for themselves when it comes to the idea of consent.
Thank you. I just wanted to add, I see the first part of the question, how might we collaborate to address FPIC challenges in solidarity with Indigenous leaders? And I appreciate the question. Thank you, Tomelin. I have to say that the Indigenous movement, especially outside of the United States, is severely under-resourced. And we need to bring those resources to these communities, specifically for capacity building and building their knowledge about FPIC, UNDRIP, and other tools that can be helpful to that community. And for that reason, we would like to ask our allies, whoever is on the call, who's watching this, talk to other folks who might have those resources. Make introductions, build solidarity with us. Only 0.4% of all international giving goes towards supporting Indigenous communities internationally. Let's change that number. Let's at least bring that to 1 or 2% to support our communities. It's really needed. And I think that's what we're really in need of. We have the expertise among all of this, all of the organizations that are represented here. What we need is your support in financial and non-financial ways through collaboration, introductions, making those financial streams that are widely available today. Mackenzie Scott has just donated $2.7 billion. None of that came to organizations that are working with Indigenous peoples internationally. None. So let's change that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Galina. And I see that Pavel has his hand raised if you want to speak now.
Спасибо большое. Нет, у меня не вопрос. Я хотел бы сделать...
Thank you so much. It's not a question. I would like just to make a note. I would like to express my gratitude to Galina and Kate for their blissful presentation. I would also like to say that today, this morning, I was participating in an event which was dedicated to the fulfillment of the leading principles of United Nations on human rights. And during this event, my colleague was speaking, my former colleague, and at this time, he's a leader of this working group in business and human rights. And he said that we all stakeholders who are dealing with stakeholders who are dealing with human rights and business, we already know where to go, but we will go in that direction when everybody will understand that if the business is not abiding by the principles of human rights of the United Nations paper, then this business is working illegally, unlawfully. And we are moving in that direction, and we have to move in that direction. And that's why all businesses have to understand that they have to already now, right now, they have to move in that direction, to work in the international field, international area, to make sure that everybody abides by the laws, by the regulations and principles that for articulated by the United Nations, and we need to set our peoples to just to direct the indigenous communities to work in the same direction.
Thank you so much. And I think now we'll also call on Jorge to speak.
Interpreters can share with Jorge. We're glad to hear his words, and we'll ask him to unmute his microphone so that we can listen to him. Thank you.
The interpreter has sent something, but Jorge is not speaking yet.
Let's just give it one more minute. It's amazing to have people joining us from many different countries and many different conditions, particularly during this time with the pandemic, with COVID. It's not an easy time. So we appreciate all the work trying to get everyone to connect. And I'll also share that if we can't get Jorge on the line live, if there's a comment interpreters would like to share from him, we'll also invite that. Huh. Let's see, let's wait one more minute. Thank you for your patience. Also because the Zoom controls sometimes don't work properly across platforms. Okay. Okay. So maybe we'll maybe we can invite Clemente to comment if there's an additional comment, or as we're waiting for a comment from Jorge, or any updates from interpreters or allies who are doing amazing support work.
Well, it's important to work with different institutions that are defenders, land defenders, especially with all of you who have helped so much, but not only in defense, but also to make visible. And also it's so
Очень важно,
important
чтобы
how communities can get together
проводилась
and
работа
unite
также в рамках
in the different
ЮНИСА.
territories. It's more difficult sometimes to because of the
Иногда гораздо
distances
труднее,
of our lands.
поскольку расстояние и удаленность наших земель.
And so
Ирина,
sometimes there are decrees.
канал.
We're trying to see how we can continue working in our lands, because there we're defined, we can work and we can do actions together. And also to have these meetings, we can continue, and in the assemblies to say that we don't have signals sometimes. And these are very inhospitable lands. We don't have telephones. So when we get together, how we can have different meetings and find the support so that we can be visible. we are very grateful and we congratulate you all, not for just for us, but for all of these. We can improve our situation and take care of the water, because water is life. And this is, we are thinking in things that can save the planet, but there are a lot of people who live in very inhospitable places. And we also don't have so much technology. And we think about the topic of the economic numbers. This is a question that we're sometimes are always brought forth in the meetings, and they're always asking us because we don't know about these things. So we have to see what is happening, and if the pressure is great and the land is very much, how many tons do we need to be for water? And how much would this be economically? Nevertheless, the country has debts, we have loans, we have to pay taxes. There are many things that affect the country. We can't always believe in what, when we're talking with people in the community, they hear the radio and they get informed and they ask, and a lot of times they say, well, what are these words? I don't know sometimes. Who is administering all of this so that this might be carried out? Nevertheless, we have rights to know, and this is not always publicized. Where is all this? It's always on the outside. It's in other countries, other foreign countries, but the communities, we're always looking what is taken out from our communities. And the people, indigenous peoples, we need to take up these tools so that we say we're living and this is how we feel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm not sure if there's an update on whether Jorge is able to speak now.
I don't think we've gotten unmute to work yet, so
if not, I can pass it back over to you, Sybil.
Okay. If there's a change, if people can, if allies can let us know in the chat, that's great. So thank you to everyone, and we have had an amazing morning this morning. It's been wonderful to hear this second session talking about tools for operationalizing free and prior informed consent, and to have that following some incredible presentations from Indigenous leaders in this area, as well as I want to honor Ella and Ragini and Alexi also, and Isak for representing youth leaders in this work. We really all appreciate what you're doing and see this as an opportunity to align behind your leadership. So I'd like to close the symposium at this time, and in doing so, I'll be asking a friend and respected colleague, Gabriel Saiz, to share some closing remarks. But before we do that, I want to honor everyone here today, the presenters, the volunteers, the allies, the audience. And I also want to reshare some of the information that we've had coming through the chat for the symposium today. So first, I'll be sharing opportunities for solidarity actions. This is a major theme today of how can we work in solidarity and align behind the leadership of Indigenous and youth leaders in this work. And these are just a few ideas, and I'll invite others on the panel to share other links if there's additional things. And let's see. Okay, hold on just one second. And okay. And then I'll also say we have some really great resources that have been coming through the chat. And so I'll share links that we've, a page that has all the links that we've shared out today, and also a Google Doc if members of the audience would like to add resources. Please feel free to add about your own work, resources you think that we should know about, that we should learn about. And then finally, I have just the summary materials from our symposium, the agenda, so you can see all the speakers. And then as a special treat, before we end today, we're able to get Jorge on video and on chat on the line. If this is just wonderful to get to hear from Jorge at the close of the meetings. And Jorge, will invite you to share some final remarks for us.
Yes, I'm so sorry because I'm not very technological, and it's really hard to get into the computer. But yes, I was listening all of the conversation, and of course, a little bit of what is happening in my community. And we were speaking about what's happening here. There's a project in Chile by satellite to have meetings and things that can be sent. And in my community, we also live by the stars. We know how the climate is, the weather. Many of our ancestors, our elders have taught us this. And with the satellites, this truly, we're really lost. We don't know. We're losing much. I'm sorry, the audio is hard. We according to our world vision, we go by the stars, we understand the meaning. And with all of this, this is losing sense. This doesn't make sense to us. Can you hear me?
Sí, señor.
Yes, sir. Okay. And this, as they were saying, when lithium and water, this is also affecting us. The amount of lithium is 20,000 liters of water that they take out. And here in the communities, this is so much. And the extraction of water is too much. And as it was documented in the beginning, this is affecting us. The agriculture is being lost, the rivers, the multinational corporations are polluting them. And so we can't do agriculture. And this is what the government is doing. I don't know if in this sense, if we can ask help from the university or scientists to help us. They're killing us as a culture, and they're killing our people. And we cannot continue like this. And with this, we'd like to get support from the universities to show the government what is happening, that this is leading to our extermination. And this, we would like to have that support, because the only way to stop this is to work together. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Don
Thank you so
Alvarez.
much, Don Jorge.
This is so appreciated as the final words of what is at stake in this work. And we appreciate your fight, and we appreciate the opportunity to learn from you and to work in solidarity together. With that, I'll pass on the mic to Gabriel Saiz. Gabriel Saiz is from the Ponca tribe of Nebraska. And I want to congratulate Gabi for completing his master's degree this year in Earth Systems. And thank you for offering the final close for us today. Over to you, Gabi.
Thank you, Sybil. I want to congratulate everyone, the incredible interpreters, activists, elders, and organizers who participated in this event and made their voices heard in this forum. I'm honored again to speak amongst such venerable people to help close out the event. In the process of learning about the struggles of multiple groups of Indigenous people across 3 continents, I've realized that these conversations have happened before. Indigenous people, if such things can be said generally, have always had incredible capacities for diplomacy, negotiation, and resistance. Our power, livelihood, and souls exist in the landscapes our ancestors have resided in for generations. As corporate and global economic interests eye our landscapes for resources to initiate a transition away from fossil fuels, or even just to harvest the rubble of our sacred sites, we have invested in understanding how corporations think, how economies operate, how to use international law, and how to operationalize solidarity movements. Our ancestors adapted in similar ways when confronted with colonial greed for furs, land, precious metals, oil, or anything else really in the past. As a young activist and environmental scientist, my key takeaways from the symposium regarding mining and green economy activities are: we need to have our communities report and record all of the social and environmental impacts of green economy activities. We have to have someone to share these reports with to keep corporations and governments accountable in academia or in activist spaces. We need to approach states and corporations on a unified front. We need to create community protocols for interacting with corporations and governments and put the onus on corporations and governments to follow those protocols and put it on them to be able to understand our communities. Non-Indigenous people have to be educated about the values of our cultures and the importance of our culture in preventing further ecological damage and environmental collapses. We always have to be diplomatic, but we must be firm as well with non-Indigenous people who wish to harvest or take advantage of our resources. In the legal realm, we must exhaust all procedural options available in our context to protect our rights. And we must always seek further recognition and autonomy in order for states, governments, and other groups of people to recognize that we rightfully should share in this new economy and should share the benefits of the new economy. To hear in so many languages this wisdom and experience makes me confident that our endeavors to protect the earth and our people will be fruitful. Ede wonge, we are all related and our strength has now been shared. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabi. Those are wise words. And with that, we'll close the meeting and look forward to being in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.